Well, it's very good to be back in Lisbon. It's not a city I know as well as I would like. I feel more familiar with your northern city of Porto. When Sylvia told me that the seminar was included people who were sociologists of education like myself and also curriculum specialists, and there are some people who work as subject teachers in the schools. And I thought I would give a particular focus to my presentation by drawing on a theme from the work of the English sociologist Basil Bernstein, because he brings the two issues around sociology of education and curriculum, the two fields, together. He was worried that, in fact, there was something, he was very worried about his own discipline, and indeed mine, that I've been part of, because in somehow or other it didn't have an analysis of what he saw as education's three key message systems: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And he set out to try and say why, and this is what I want to give the first part of my talk to. In the second part, I'll say something about the particular developments around the debate about powerful knowledge that have taken place, particularly in England. Not, I should clearly say, in the UK, because very different debates go on in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and in Wales. I hope this will be not too unrelated to your discussions in later sessions about autonomy, but I thought that possibly I would just say a word just to remind those of you who are not familiar with the English system that in many ways, when I heard David D'Astino talk briefly earlier about the networks, that in a sense we face a completely opposite situation to Portugal. We had a strongly decentralized, strong local system of education in England, organized by elected local governments. And this is being steadily undermined by governments in the interests, from their point of view, of, in fact, schools being more efficient in what they do. They've done this through two apparently contradictory but actually related ways: through significant increase in regulation, through the inspection system and through the ranking of schools, through funding and through the qualifications and examinations. On the other hand, they've promoted institutional autonomy by allowing schools to, or fund schools to, leave local government and become, in a sense, state schools with private funding. We call them, bizarrely, either free schools, or which are not free, or, in fact, academies. I think that's because it has an old traditional name. This institutional autonomy means that less than half our schools now have to follow the national curriculum, and they are increasingly controlled rather than regulated by an exam system and a system of inspection. This has led to a very, many ways, contradictory situation, I think. The only move that, in fact, towards approaching the issue of autonomy in England is that, in fact, the Labour government has produced a very weak policy for a national education service. And they have at least picked up on the fact that if you give autonomy, increasing autonomy to individual schools, then in fact you have a problem that they are allowed to select their pupils, and in fact some pupils find it very difficult, or parents of pupils find it very difficult to get to school at all. And this could, so this is a serious issue. Now I mention that, and also, and this relates, I suppose, more directly to where I work, that in fact, on the question of the curriculum, within the broad field of education studies, which includes curriculum studies and sociology and other disciplines, it is itself deeply divided. It's divided between those that I have in fact been associated with, who emphasize the importance of there being a common, what I call powerful knowledge for all pupils, and which, because of shortage of funds and in fact regulation, becomes not knowledge for all, but I would call it memorization and testing for all. And on the other hand, you have the other strands of the educational studies community who in a sense resist, they see the emphasis on knowledge as actually in a sense undermining the opportunities for the more disadvantaged pupils, and emphasize that the curriculum should be defined much more in relation to the needs of children, individual children. And as a result of that, of course, you actually get greater inequality. So I think we are in a sense in a very difficult situation in many ways in which we in England, and I think that's why I'm extremely sorry that I shan't be staying till tomorrow, and because I think I've got a lot to learn from others in Europe who will be talking later. Just to go back to Basil Bernstein for a bit, my focus on him has a somewhat biographical aspect. He was my tutor. He was later my head of department. He became one of the strongest critics of my early work, associated, David, you mentioned, with the new sociology of education. And in the last 10 or 15 years, I think his work has influenced mine more than anyone I can think of. So it's quite a career for Basil Bernstein in relation to me. When I did my master's degree, sociology of education was solely concerned with the distribution of educational opportunities and how in England that opportunities were largely determined by social class. So I remember my surprise when Bernstein, my tutor, said to me, write a dissertation on the curriculum. Now, he's if anybody here has met him, he's not an easy person to say no to. And I certainly couldn't do that. So I had to go off and try and write a dissertation about a field which, in fact, sociologists had not discussed at all. It was before, I mean, all his work up till then, as some of you will know, was been on language codes. And he hadn't got involved in the curriculum by then, and there was practically nothing written at all. So my dissertation, which I'm glad to say nobody will be able to find, I think, I ended up writing about trying to ask the question, why sociologists appear so little interest in what, for most people would say, was at the heart of education, curriculum. When I look at sociology of education journals today, in the USA, even more than in England, I find very little has changed. A colleague of mine, some of you have come across in curriculum field, Deng Zongyi, and he edits the Journal of Curriculum Studies. He tried to get a symposium on the sociology of the curriculum that related to my work accepted by AERA, the American Education Research Association. Some of you have ever been to that. It's about 14,000 education researchers. It's an intimidating experience, I can tell you. I went once and I haven't been again. Anyway, I mention that because the proposal for the symposium on the sociology of the curriculum was turned down by all the different sessions of AERA. It was turned down by the sociologists of education because it didn't have enough quantitative data. It was turned down by the curriculum people because it was dealing with knowledge and not with the very rarefied things that curriculum theory gets involved with these days. Anyway, it was quite a lesson. Back in London, my colleagues now, and I wonder one of these days when I completely retire rather than partly retire, my colleagues, my doctoral students are mostly Chinese, and some of them are quite excellent. Occasionally they're Brazilians. I haven't had one for some time in actual Portuguese. And my colleagues that I write with are either from Australia or New Zealand or South Africa. And more recently, which I have found very exciting, what is going on in England, is that I've been working more with teacher educators, people who work with school teachers who are specialists in particular school subjects. And they have got interested in sociology of education, and some of you may have come across the book that I wrote with my colleague David Lambert, who's a geographer, called Knowledge in the Future School. This was a kind of attempt, really, to make what seemed rather abstract ideas in sociology relevant to teachers. And we came up with the idea of powerful knowledge as a curriculum principle that could be applied in schools. It was largely a response. I gave a talk at that time to a group of on the curriculum, to a group of headmasters and headmistresses in schools. And after I'd given the talk, somebody came up to me, who I'd never met before, and said, "I've read your book." Now, I never thought for a moment that, in fact, head teachers read books by sociologists of education. So I was very taken by this. So I said, "Well, that's wonderful. We must meet." And it was really in discussions with her that led to this book. And she has, Carolyn Roberts is her name, she has a chapter in the book that David Lambert and I wrote. And in it, I think, is what she calls, in her chapter, what she calls a manifesto for my school. She was, and basically this has got 10 points, and if I thought about it, I would have brought it, 10 points about why knowledge is important. And I thought to myself, it expresses it better than I could. It was, and I've used it in a whole range of different countries, even, believe it or not, Vietnam. We discussed this manifesto, and it was a manifesto for knowledge. Now, I still find, but anyway, that was what, certainly, that was what led to the book, Knowledge in the Future School. I still find this neglect by English sociologists of the curriculum, and the fact that we had in England Bernstein, who with Bourdieu is arguably the greatest sociologist of education there's been since Durkheim. I find it a puzzle. And what I wanted to say a little bit about was Bernstein's attempt to make sense of this. from the early 1970s, he had a major concern, which I disregarded completely at the time, even though I was in the same department as him, completely. And he thought the two major traditions in sociology of education were deeply misguided, and that they had two assumptions that had led the field in the wrong direction that I've since come to question myself. One was that sociology, and sociology of education in particular, should always be seen about the distribution of power in society. That's the starting point of any sociology. Now, in a sense, once you look at the distribution of power, you tend to think about how you can reduce or remove that power. And that actually takes you, in a sense, into politics, and it takes you away from thinking about what's happening in education. And the other thing that he was worried about was the kind of social constructivist critique that was dominant in the new sociology of education, which critiqued everything in any curriculum and pedagogy in terms of power relation and how it was disadvantaging working class kids. Now, it's not that there's not some truth in that, but he actually thought that, in a sense, and I think this is the thing I learned, that to work in education studies, critique is not enough, because in the end, education is a practical thing that people are doing in the schools, and if all you're doing is showing why they're getting it wrong, then in a sense you're not being a resource that you would hope that education research would be. He picked out a quote from something I had forgotten, but I wrote, where I said, way back then, and here I quote, "The principles of the selection of organization of knowledge that underlie curricula and their institutional and interactional setting in schools and classrooms and in the wider social structure, that massive project is the job of the sociology of education." However, the problem was we just criticized the existing system and we didn't take up that program. And when I look back, as you get older, you find yourself looking back more, and you always hope that you're not just looking back nostalgically, but you're looking back to learn, and so you don't make the same mistakes again. I think the reason was that, in a sense, we didn't have an adequate theoretical framework to actually tackle those big issues. And so we ended up by saying, we'll just point out how bad everything is, and possibly some other people will come up with the better ideas. And I won't go into that because it had a rather a personal turn, those of us involved in that had an almost oppositional relationship to Bernstein at the time, and some of his writings became increasingly obscure, and very little notice was taken of him. The second approach that Bernstein thought was misguided was one that is probably more familiar because it's persisted, and in many ways is stronger theory, is basically the cultural reproduction theory of people like Pierre Bourdieu. Wherever I go, I'm surprised, for instance, that Bourdieu is the leading sociologist of education in China. Now, take that in and think about that in relation to the Chinese Communist Party, and we will think. What Bernstein did was to try and explain why he thought this was misguided. And here's a quote, what he says. He says, the theory of cultural reproduction, which says that the theory of cultural reproduction the theories, those theories and approaches presuppose what is not addressed by them, and perhaps inadvertently what cannot be addressed by them as a consequence of the form they take. I want to try and explain that. But what they did not address, of course, was the substance of education, because in fact they actually thought that education was doing society's work, sustaining inequalities or whatever, preparing well or badly, preparing for labour markets, those kind of things. This is how he expressed what cultural reproduction theories did, and I quote. He was interested in how the cultural features of the curriculum disguise the power relations which they transmit through the maintenance of symbolic violence, as schooling becomes almost a kind of pathology, because schooling is just producing the inequalities and the failures that, in a sense, we experience. He argued that this diagnosis, treating existing curricula and pedagogies as a kind of pathology, perpetuating inequality, what they do is to fail to describe the non-pathological form of pedagogic discourse, what's going on in the school. They expressed the way schooling privileges the interests of a dominant group, and they misrepresent the cultures of, this is what schooling does, this is what they say. However, what it doesn't do is to generate any specific descriptions of what goes on in school that might or might not do that. Now, it took me, and the question was why? And it took me a long time to go back to Bernstein and begin to get a sense of an answer. And I'm very grateful to colleagues, doctoral students in particular, who've helped me to actually go through that journey and to actually, in a sense, get a different angle on Bernstein. Because what he said was, and what they did, and this is important, I hope I can explain it to you, was that in fact, the idea of cultural reproduction has the view of education as a carrier of relations outside of education. So it's a kind of passive carrier. It's like, in fact, you put the stuff on the train and it carries to the next station. So what happens then is that education is a kind of black box relaying, sorry, this is the key word, relaying patterns of dominance with respect to class, patriarchy, and race. And so the what of education, actually what's happening in the classroom, what knowledge is being learnt, what processes are going on there, is disregarded. And the what, actually what those of us, well, I used to teach chemistry in school many years ago, and some of you are school teachers now, many of us do in our everyday lives, from the point of view of cultural reproduction, becomes a vacuum with no structures, no forms, and no rules. And so, in a sense, the content becomes empty. And that's why, in a sense, sociologists, for a long time, have never actually bothered to try and understand that content, because it's been treated as empty, because everything that was happening was being determined from outside. This assumes that the internal relations, what goes on in a school, which arguably ought to be the subject of analysis of a social science, is not worth investigating. Now, I think you can understand how attractive this was and still is to many academics. It gave them a kind of unique critical stance on the prevailing system, but it didn't offer them any alternatives or anything that anyone could do. I found this to an I sent to one or two colleagues here, I found this to exaggerated extent when I go to Brazil, as I've been to quite a few times, in fact, particularly in the areas of sociology and curriculum studies, which have become, some of them have become so rarefied and so removed that you can no longer recognize that there's anything called curriculum at all. There are exceptions there, I assure you, and I was talking to Francisco last night about Dimitri Saviani, some of you have come across, who I think has a really, really interesting analysis and is not known widely enough. So the focus of cultural reproduction then is limited to understanding how external power relations are carried by the education system. And I mentioned earlier, my Chinese doctoral students tell me that in fact this cultural reproduction theory is no less prevalent, popular in China at all. And we've tried to puzzle out why it is there. It's as if pathologizing what goes on in schools has some function for academics. I'm interested in discussion to what extent this applies at all in Portugal. It certainly does in England. Now, I think that this phenomenon, which I think is important, whether one is a social scientist or curriculum studies or any field, and indeed somebody studying to become initial training of teacher, because in a sense you get some of this there. I think Bernstein introduced one of his most original and, I think, neglected insights. It's the distinction between treating education as a relay of society's inequalities. His argument was that the sociology of education, particularly theories like Bourdieu's, had focused only on what was relayed and said nothing about the relay itself. So from the point of view of cultural reproduction, pedagogic practice, what teachers do in schools, relay class relations, they relay gender relations, they relay race relations, they relay all kinds of things external to education itself. And Bernstein's argument was that sociology of education had to analyze what is specific to education as a relay, something that in various ways some of us working in the sociology of the curriculum in recent years have in fact tried to do. And as I mentioned earlier, this has largely been outside of England, although often within Anglophone countries. So what those, I think, and many of those people have been inspired by Bernstein's work, with not necessarily grasping the whole theory. But what they have done is to hold on to the distinction between pedagogic and curriculum practice as a relay and pedagogic practice as what the practice relays, the what and the how, as he said. Here's a rather cryptic quote from Bernstein, which we can return to, which I thought that it was worth mentioning. He says this, and it depends. If you accept that as a teacher, what your primary thing you're trying to do always is to transmit valued knowledge. There's no, that, it's difficult to not disagree with that, that in a sense, schools have a unique role in passing knowledge on from one generation to another, and as knowledge has become more specialized, we've needed more specialized institutions like schools, and this is in fact what teachers are doing. He says, if we are to understand transmission, and it is the big question, I think, that in fact the sociology of the curriculum has not properly yet addressed, and I'll come back to that towards the end. He says, we must be able to understand what he calls the relations to social class, gender and race, and relations within. And it's the relations within, both in relation to transmission and acquisition, that are largely unresearched. So I want to make one final distinction, which has been important from Bernstein, and be a bit more concrete. He makes a distinction between what he calls surface and deep metaphors. That sounds rather abstract, but actually I think when I thought about it, I resisted the example that he gave us to start with, but I actually think it's really powerful. Now, he is concerned with what he calls the deep metaphors that underlie how we think, theorize, do research, analysis in education. And he reckons that very often we just stay at the level of surface. And that is true about much empirical research. And I think it's important to realize that we've tried to, a lot of empirical research tries to model itself on the natural sciences, where in a sense the empirical research is rooted in a very precise theory, but we're in a context where we don't have a precise theory. So what we tend to do is to root our empirical research in our preconceptions, which are often not examined. He gives, I don't know whether he's a bit unfair on that, on Bourdieu, but he's always having a bit of a go at Bourdieu through his time. I think they saw themselves as cross-the-channel competitors somehow or other. But he was once invited to be a visiting professor at the Sorbonne, at the École Pratique, I think this is where Bourdieu was. And he was invited to come for a term, and he lasted 2 weeks, because clearly they didn't, in fact, actually form a close relationship. He gives the example of habitus, which is a favourite Bourdieu concept, which I find a lot of students use it and think that they've explained something, and perhaps they have. Anyway, what Bernstein says is that the problem with Bourdieu's concept of habitus is that, in fact, it's exemplified by the outcomes it gives of habitus, not the deep metaphor that underlies it, in which case then it may not be such a good concept. Anyway, what it doesn't do, and I've never come across it doing, what it doesn't do is actually to generate new ways of thinking about educational policy practice, which is what we want. In reflecting on his own work, he suggests that he inherited his tacitly his deep metaphor from Durkheim, and what his project was about in his work was actually making that metaphor more explicit. And Bernstein's metaphor was boundary as a fundamental resource that makes us human. For instance, I would argue that in fact non-humans, animals, have a very weak sense of boundary, whereas humans have a very strong sense of boundary that starts with knowing what your name is, what your family is, who you are. Durkheim developed it from studying anthropological studies of primitive societies and how, for instance, totems symbolized the boundaries which told a community which clan they were members of. And he extended the idea of boundary more generally. For example, the boundaries between subjects in the curriculum, classification of knowledge, the boundaries between school and the community, framing of knowledge, the boundaries between the powerful and the powerless. Wherever you look, and I think, when I was thinking about this, in thinking about the decisions that teachers have to make, they're constantly involved in resisting, breaking, or going beyond boundaries. For instance, pupils bring knowledge to school and then confront the boundary between the knowledge they bring and the knowledge of the school curriculum. And it's the teacher's difficult task for enabling them to make that boundary crossing so that without actually undermining them. And that's why teaching is an important role, I think, in society. but schools are only one example, I think. But all they are at heart, they are rule makers and therefore boundary makers. And in a sense, in that boundary making and boundary breaking, so forth, are the power relations. But not if you pull power out and just see power over, then in fact you've forgotten what the roots of the power are, theoretical roots. It's true about any innovation. To return to his idea of relay and what is relayed, that's another boundary. For instance, a country's concern with what boundaries it constructs in a national curriculum or standards used by examiners, and the micro concern with teachers about how to construct boundaries in their everyday life in the classroom. When I started studying and teaching sociology, my deep metaphor was hierarchy. It must be something to do with my family growing up. I'm not quite sure. I've never done that bit of psychoanalysis. But I've since come to agree with Bernstein that hierarchies presuppose boundaries, and which is why I think he was right to make boundaries as his foundation metaphor. And it's why, and we can perhaps debate this for those of you who think very differently, why I think Bernstein has more to say to us, Durkheim has more to say to us in sociology, generally sociology of education, curriculum theory, than Marx. And why is this? It's because, in a sense, and I'll give you, I think best way is to give a quote, what going beyond a boundary he means. He means it offers the possibility of thinking the not yet thought by actually going beyond the boundary, which may have said, no, you can't think that way, because teachers are always saying that. I used to have students doing a dual course at the Institute in sociology and philosophy. They would learn a lot of things from me. They would move across to their philosophy seminar, and they were immediately told, you can't say that. You can't say that. You're going across the boundary. This is philosophy. Now, I'm not saying we should abolish boundary at all, but I just think that we need to realize the potential that they have. So I'd like to turn finally to one or two points about the powerful knowledge idea in England. It arose, as I think I mentioned, it arose to try and counter, first of all, a prevailing approach to the curriculum, which, in fact, is to see it as representing knowledge of the powerful, that it was always going to be an imposition of the powerful over the powerless. But it's been picked up in a variety of ways. But where it started was that, certainly, I mean, I never know who actually started it, but when I started using it, I wanted to say we need to shift what sociologists are thinking about in light of the argument I made from Bernstein. In light of that, we need to shift that. We need to think about the structuring of knowledge in education, because that is going to be critical to, in fact, who has access to it and who doesn't. If you just focus on the distribution of the knowers, you'll never get to what they are being denied or having access to. Powerful knowledge was loosely picked up within the education community and in 2010 by our newly elected conservative-led right-wing government. And they used the idea of powerful knowledge, or often still do, as a kind of instrument of accountability. If you could take powerful knowledge as a standard, then in a sense you could assess and evaluate schools on the extent, the proportion of their pupils who actually achieve this knowledge. And they managed, it was quite clever, because I always think, there's never been a conservative, I always think conservatives are cleverer often than in fact those of us who are not conservative. And one of the things they managed to do was to link the notion of powerful knowledge to social justice. Well, on the one hand, of course, access to powerful knowledge should be social justice, but in fact, the people who work in social justice never mentioned knowledge. And they linked it so they could actually then, what they could then say to the schools is any child, if they work hard enough, can get access. So don't give us that, in fact, there are these factors. This is the right of any child. So it was quite powerful in terms of an accountability model. Now, what some of us are trying to do, not particularly in England, but certainly partly, is to actually try and reconceptualize the idea of powerful knowledge. Because Joe Muller, who works in Cape Town, and I've written quite a lot with, we came across a book which I strongly recommend if you are at all interested in this area, it's a book on power. And he comes up with something like all interesting ideas. Once you've grasped them, they seem obvious. And he says that power has two completely different meanings. One is power over others. And that is the dominant view in sociology and politics. It's associated with Marx, Max Weber, Wright Mills. Very prevalent, that. Always power over. You focus on power elite, power. But there's also a notion of what he calls power to, the capacity to do something, the extent to which the capacity, the fact that some knowledge gives you power to think new thoughts. If you like, it's the element of power that says that, in fact, education can be emancipatory. So it's, in a sense, and if you're thinking about education, you've actually got to hold on to, and that's the difficult thing, those two contradictory notions of power. Now, what we've come to realize is that while the idea of powerful knowledge can establish the form and content of knowledge to be stipulated, it does not follow that by stipulating the content, that this includes power to as well as power over. And this, I think, is the issue that we're struggling with. Debates in England are concerned with issues about the relationships between subjects and disciplines and their different purposes. That's an important one. Disciplines are still the primary way that scholars and researchers organize knowledge to produce new knowledge. The primary purpose of school subjects is very different. It's about the transmission and acquisition of knowledge by students. Bernstein identified two processes that, in a sense, are still deeply under-researched that underlie both of them. They are what he called recontextualization, which meant taking concepts out of a discipline and putting them into a subject so that they could be accessible to learners. And pedagogization, which was the actual practice of developing a relationship with students that, in fact, that teachers have to develop if they're going to succeed at all. The pressure from government has been on the stipulation of content in syllabuses, examinations, and so forth. And so it's been a kind of top, and it's linked, as I mentioned earlier, to the inspection model, and therefore because in fact, therefore to schools competing with each other. What this model only minimal addresses is the fact that the resources for acquiring knowledge are, in England anyway, very unequally distributed. In other words, if you rank schools on those, I mean, and you really don't need to do the ranking of schools. You could just look at them. You could look at where their parents come from. You look at whether they pay fees. You look at various kinds of external things, and you could rank them without having any data on them from what the schools do. They actually, that is the classic relayed example. Acquiring powerful knowledge is something that is achieved in some schools very successfully. But we need to look at what is the conditions of those schools, because they are always what I would call high-resource schools. The parents pay large fees, they have very good facilities, everything there. And then you shift that to a school in a multicultural area in East London, and the resources are entirely different. There's a kind of 5 or 6 times difference. And therefore, and so in a sense, I think what we have to do is, in a sense, is to realize that a curriculum is not only a stipulation of knowledge, but it's actually a stipulation of resources as well. At least the national system of inspection in England is undergoing a reform, and it's quite encouraging. It'll be interesting to see what they managed to achieve, because they have realized that the current inspecting of schools is dominated by performance scores. And if the inspection dominates in terms of how you grade schools, then schools are going to rationally respond like that. And in fact, they're going to emphasize memorization, regurgitation knowledge, and so forth. So this inspection, but I think the inspection hasn't realized how difficult it is to actually form an inspection system that doesn't do that. So, to conclude, and I hope I haven't gone on too long, we have, certainly in England, 2 versions of a knowledge-based curriculum in the last, and it's in a period which has been characterised, some probably true in Portugal as well, by cuts and also of funding, and also acute problems of teacher supply, particularly teachers in specialist subjects like physics and foreign languages. Now, I don't think that what we've been trying to do, it doesn't offer short-term solutions. And also we're up against a problem which probably you don't have in Portugal and other countries, that in a sense governments are extremely sceptical about all education studies, all university-based teacher training. They've encouraged schools to start training their own teachers, all kinds of different systems to undermine, because they've assumed that in a bizarre way, and there were some things wrong with schools of education in England, that in a sense they've assumed that they were actually undermining the goals of giving access to knowledge. What also has happened in England, and maybe it's also true in other European countries, is that teachers have begun to seek their own autonomy, both from government and from university-based researchers. And there's a flourishing online debate about curriculum and pedagogy on Twitter and Facebook. I'm amazed. People keep telling me, you must follow it. You must spend your hour of every morning looking at Twitter and seeing what's there. You come up, they mention you, and occasionally I do, and I kind of have a headache. But anyway, the point is, I mean, obviously, potentially, it has some kind of potential, but in a sense, inevitably, they are drawn to simplistic solutions, fads and fashions, focusing on what is an immediate acute problem also of teachers in state schools, discipline, rather than, in fact, knowledge acquisition. And when you look at where they get the ideas from, particularly things like, I don't know if you have them at all in other countries, but schools started taking up things called scripted lessons. When I saw one, actually I was absolutely horrified that in a sense the teachers, somebody is appointed to write the scripts for a whole lesson. These are distributed to the pupils in the class and to the teacher, and the teacher goes through the script line by line, getting them to repeat them or through, and then afterwards they get tested on them. That's a scripted lesson for you. I mean, I think it's quite scary. The other thing that is quite scary is the introduction of what's called zero tolerance discipline. That in fact you have schools where as soon as you come out of a class, you're in a corridor, you have to be silent. You have to be silent. You have to be silent in school meals because that's a form of social order. And I don't know what it's doing in a sense, but I get very worried about it. What I realise, speaking as a sociologist now and as a kind of curriculum theorist, is that the question of knowledge and its acquisition is a much trickier issue than I thought when I gaily wrote a book called Bringing Knowledge Back In. I didn't know what I was bringing back, really, that I was bringing back something. I was bringing back, often, a problem. And when I started to talk to some schools who think they've introduced a knowledge-based curriculum, one of the things I said is that the thing that you have to start by focusing on, is that this is going to be very difficult, that it is not something that there's a short-term solution to. They didn't really want to hear. But I still think, and just to relate to something I said at the very beginning, that there is a kind of issue which I think is most important, and that is the question, teachers, by very virtue of their profession, have a specialist knowledge in particular fields. The tricky, difficult thing they face all the time is how does that specialist knowledge become part of the consciousness of their pupils? And I think that remains a very difficult thing. And it's why, in a sense, the knowledge-based curriculum is not just a curriculum issue, it's a pedagogic issue. And in the end, it's also a broader political issue because, in fact, if you take the pedagogic component, you can relatively cheaply stipulate well. You can borrow from Americans like E.D. Hirsch. You may have come across. You can stipulate a curriculum, but actually, once it comes to be part of what goes on in school, then it's going to cost money, and in a sense, many state schools don't have money. The other thing, I think, is that when I compare England to other countries, I used to visit Finland a lot and haven't recently been, but there you get a completely different sense of a society actually valuing education and what teachers do. And because they value that, that is communicated to teachers and to the pupils. And you don't go to Finland to find create innovative pedagogies. And people sometimes are disappointed. You have to look elsewhere. What you have to look at differently. You have to look almost theoretically. And to use the Bernstein metaphor, you have to look at the deep metaphor of, and in this case, the deep metaphor is about valuing education. I'll stop there. But if we've got time, I'm delighted to have questions.
Yes. We don't have time, but we must search for him. Perhaps we have 5 or 10 minutes more, and I will accept 2 or 3 questions or commentaries, and Professor Young will answer them. Francisco is the first one.
Obrigado. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming here, and thank you very much for your huge contribution to the field of curriculum studies by bringing in the issue of knowledge. With regard to your excellent presentation, I have a question. As far as I understood, you suggested that educational theory that is based on theories of social reproduction somehow misses curriculum itself. Am I right? Okay. Would you agree on the idea that a similar phenomenon has also occurred in that strand of curriculum studies that is inspired by cultural studies and consequently emphasizes issues of identity as a key issue. By doing that, are they somehow also losing sight of curriculum itself?
It's always nice to have questions that you think you and the questioner agree to the answer. Because we had a brief word about this last night, but I didn't put him up for it. Okay. I think that what these new cultural studies... Is it working? Yes. Is it right? Yes. What these cultural studies approaches, I think, do is that they forget that pedagogy is a specialized activity, and that in fact curriculum is a specialized organization of knowledge for a particular purpose. That in a sense you can't just dream up any old philosopher, however brilliant in his time, and sort of throw him in and say, look, this raises another question. Of course it raises another question, but it doesn't raise the question that in a sense schools are about. Schools are, I think, if they're going to take seriously their democratic role, they are about giving access to knowledge, because the other thing, one of the quotes I didn't give from Bernstein, is that in fact what pupils need to do is to have the conceptual resources when they grow up to actually participate in a society's conversation about itself. That's another thing you put. And when you think about that, that's a wonderful definition of citizenship. But it's also, it's actually, you have to focus on the curriculum and the pedagogy of that. It's no good getting carried away by cultural studies. So I very much agree. And I mean, they tell me this, they both complement each other, I fear, cultural reproduction theory and cultural studies. I'm not against cultural studies as a study in itself at all. I think this is done from, I mean, there have been some marvelous things, people like Raymond Williams in England, very, very good studies. But I do think that the issue, and it's a relatively new issue that I've realized, which is why it's in the title of the latest book of Joe's and mine, and that is that the issue of specialization. That is for instance, one of the things that I've begun to try and think more about is that is this question about the relationship between a discipline, which is where people are trying to produce new knowledge, and a subject in the curriculum, where people are trying to actually transmit knowledge to those who don't know it. Now, those are very different purposes. They have something common in terms of their concepts, but they are different forms of specialization. And I just think that that specialization is something. I think the two things that I think this kind of theory that Francisco's mentioned have forgotten. One is specialization, and the other is boundary, because they're all for throwing out boundaries. You know, in a sense, boundaries. Now, what I learned from Durkheim and from Bernstein is that boundaries are both a constraint and an enabling. They actually give identities to learners who want to study more, and actually the boundaries actually help them focus their studies. And at some point or other, they'll break the boundaries, but on the whole, they'll probably have to go a long way studying before they get to breaking them. Because if they break them before they understand the boundaries, they will not get anywhere. So I think that that's another thing that we need to hold on to, which is why such research as there is convinces me that interdisciplinary studies are not a way of promoting access to powerful knowledge. There's a good essay question. Okay.
Okay, another one. Okay. Estamos a transmitir em streaming.
Professor Michael Young, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
My question is between the relation between the appropriation of the curriculum by teachers and pupils, students, and the school like a consumer society. This is two ways of thinking about the curriculum. And in Portugal, at this moment, we have an initiative from the government. It's the project of flexibility and curricular autonomy. And I'm a teacher at school, and we are looking at the curriculum, at the essential learning, and another document. It's the profile of students at the end of the obligatory education. And we are working with the center of the school, the center of the work of the students. And I would like to have your opinion about this kind of work, the appropriation of the curriculum for students and teachers.
Now, I think it's very pertinent and interesting question, which is, in a sense, I'll translate it and hope into my thing and hope that makes sense. Schools are encouraged to be more flexible about their curriculum. What does that mean, and who is it going to benefit? Now, I think that we have to be careful with these rather generic terms like flexibility and generic. They're rather like 21st century skills and genericism. I think we have to be careful about them because on the one hand, flexibility could mean it could mean actually breaking down the curriculum altogether at its worst, because it could mean that you must be always flexible to what students say. But actually, if a teacher is always flexible towards what students say, it stops being a school, because you can be flexible to people in your everyday life. You don't need a school, because a school is actually about not being flexible sometimes. I mean, there are different ways of interpreting flexibility. Obviously, I mean, a school needs to have the flexibility of its own location, of the pupils' community that come from. It would be absurd to have an external curriculum legislates everything. I mean, there used to be a story when we were less sympathetic to the French than we are now, that used to say that the minister would be able to tell you at 9:43 on Tuesday morning what every pupil was studying in every school in France. Now, I'm sure that is false, but nevertheless, that is a way of an exaggerated version of non-flexibility. And I think that that flexibility is rather like boundary. That in a sense, first of all, you've got to ask what flexibility for. It's not just, I mean, there's no sense in which flexibility is some kind of good thing. Hooray, I'm flexible. I mean, you've just joined us. Good. What do you teach, Jim? What do you teach? Oh, I teach anything. I'm just flexible. I teach anything. Now, I wouldn't want my children or grandchildren to go to a school which is staffed by flexible teachers who only taught flexibility, because they haven't really asked what the flexibility is for. So I think, in a sense, I had an interesting, long time ago, I've lost touch with him now, but I remember having a conversation with a German social scientist. We were actually doing, believe it or not, we were doing an evaluation of Finnish polytechnics. And we were having a conversation about this. And he, in English, he came up, he said, I think that a better concept than flexibility is flexicurity, which is in a sense bridging security, which can become rigid, and flexibility, which can change. And that if you hold them together, and then you ask the purpose question, because, for instance, you can be, you probably can be more flexible if you're teaching, say, Portuguese literature than if you're teaching Portuguese physics, because it's not much help to be that flexible. But in Portuguese physics, because Portuguese physics is remarkably like English physics and everybody else's physics, whereas Portuguese literature is not. And it's, for instance, it's very important, I think, if you're a teacher of literature, that in a sense, the teacher themselves has got to kind of care about the book that they're telling about. There's no good teaching something that that's not you don't identify with. So I think we have to look at the question that's being posed also in terms of purpose, in terms of the double-edgedness, and thirdly, in terms of what happens across the curriculum. Because the answer is not going to be the same. Because there are areas where there isn't any flexibility. I'll give you another example, which is crude, but you'll forgive me for it. I once gave this example. I found suddenly that two of the people were from New Zealand in the audience, and that was a bit embarrassing. We had a discussion about, as you know, a third of the New Zealand community are Maoris, who've been there for 1,000 years. There's a great emphasis to respect Maori culture and so forth. And so you get things like Maori maths. Now, one of the things I discovered was that in Maori maths, so this is an example of flexibility in the interests of multiculturalism. In Maori maths, 2 plus 2 equals, anybody? Anybody? Well, no, what the answer is in Maori maths, 2 plus 2. Well, I'll give you the answer right. 2 plus 2 is 3. Now, it's perfectly rational in the Maori context. Fishing communities, they fish out, they pull out 2, they pull out 2 more, and they throw 1 back to maintain the stock. And so they end up with 3 fish, and 2 plus 2 is 3. But as we had the debate, that is not, you can't be flexible about arithmetic. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, let's have the coffee break. Thank you.